It took just 5 seconds. Judge Richard Holloway leaned back, smirked, and humiliated a woman in front of a packed courtroom. "Another one who thinks she's above the law," he scoffed. But the woman didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just waited. And when she reached into her blazer, the entire courtroom stopped breathing. Who was she? And why did the judge go pale before she even said a word? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom was still, almost reverent, but not for the right reasons. It wasn't respect that silenced the room. It was fear, not just of the gavel, but of what it represented in the hands of a man like him. The air hung heavy, thick not with heat, but with history, the kind of weight that seeps from walls that have seen too many verdicts passed without fairness. Rows of wooden benches stretched beneath dim, flickering overhead lights. The polish on the wood reflected a cold, clinical glow that made everything feel more like an operating room than a hall of justice. It was a place that didn't breathe, it braced. A place that had learned to expect injustice long before it arrived. At the front of it all, elevated like a monarch surveying his kingdom, sat Judge Richard Holloway. He was carved from stone, his scowl a fixture, his posture soaked in the kind of authority that came from years of being obeyed without question. His fingers tapped the mahogany bench with a rhythm that reeked of impatience and control. Tap, 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 like a countdown to something ugly. This wasn't a man who interpreted law. He dispensed it, like punishment, like certainty. Holloway wasn't just a judge. He was a gatekeeper in a system that punished you before it even heard you. Across the room, seated quietly at the defense table, was Jasmine Crockett, composed, unmoving, and silent. She didn't shift in her chair or avert her gaze. She simply watched, waited. When Holloway reached for the case file, he didn't treat it like a responsibility. He treated it like clutter, like noise in his day, like yet another example of someone wasting his time. His silver brows furrowed, not in concentration, but in condescension, as though even the paper offended him by existing. Then he chuckled, just once, low and dry, sharp as broken glass, a sound that didn't need volume to wound. "Another one who thinks she's above the law," he said, loud enough to mark the moment. The words slipped from his mouth with the ease of habit, like this wasn't the first time he'd said them. It wasn't. For men like Holloway, it was practically reflex, a weapon disguised as wit, a script passed down from a courtroom culture that rewarded confidence in the absence of empathy. His eyes never met Jasmine's. Not really. He looked in her direction, but he wasn't seeing her. He was seeing an idea, a problem, a challenge that dared to walk into his courtroom in heels and a tailored suit. The statement wasn't just about this moment. It was about everything he believed shouldn't belong in his world. Women like her, dressed like that, speaking with clarity, refusing to shrink. His laughter wasn't casual, it was strategic, a public declaration that he had already placed her beneath him, and that no evidence, no credentials, no truth could change that. But the woman sitting across from him wasn't just another case file. She was the reckoning he didn't see coming. Jasmine Crockett sat with the posture of a soldier and the stillness of a storm held at bay. Her navy blue suit was perfectly tailored, sharp at the shoulders, cinched at the waist, an armor of fabric, signaling she had not come to play defense. Her hands rested calmly on the table before her, fingers interlocked with intention, unmoving yet full of energy waiting to be unleashed. She didn't fidget. She didn't flinch. Every breath she took was measured, as if the oxygen itself had to pass inspection before being allowed into her lungs. While the courtroom vibrated with whispers and quiet judgments, she remained a fortress of silence. She was the only still thing in a room teeming with assumptions. Every pair of eyes that landed on her body, her skin, her suit, her silence, was filtering her existence through layers of bias older than the courthouse itself. The fact that she sat alone, without a legal team or show of force, only added to their presumption. She must not know what she's doing. Jasmine knew exactly what she was doing, but Jasmine's silence wasn't the only sound in the room. Something else was spreading now. Discomfort. The courtroom froze. not from the words, but from the intent behind them. Jurors stiffened. A few exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes darting to Jasmine, then back to the bench as if searching for a cue. Was this normal? Was this allowed? The prosecutor coughed lightly, feigning distraction with his notes, while the bailiff's jaw twitched, the only hint that anyone felt the punch of those 10 words. The court reporter blinked but kept typing, her fingers clacking on the keyboard, like she didn't just hear a verdict delivered before the trial had begun. The young prosecutor didn't say a word. His silence screamed louder than any objection he might have raised. As the judge's mocking words echoed through the chamber, he lowered his eyes, not in thought, but in avoidance. His pen twirled between his fingers, a nervous tick barely hiding the fact that he was shrinking into his seat. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at his notes, at his shoes, at anywhere but the place where courage was required. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was habit, or maybe he'd already learned that in this courtroom, challenging the man in the robe wasn't worth the fallout. Either way, he chose silence, and in doing so, he chose a side. And yet, in the middle of all of it, Jasmine Crockett sat unmoved, her spine straight, her chin high, her eyes forward. She'd heard worse, much worse, but there was something different about hearing it from the bench, from someone cloaked in the authority of the law. It didn't sting because it was surprising. It stung because it was expected. What made it unbearable wasn't just the comment, it was the certainty with which it was delivered. Holloway wasn't questioning her, he was declaring her. Declaring that she was one of those people, one of the ones who thought too highly of themselves, one of the ones who disrespected the system. He didn't say black, he didn't say woman, he didn't have to. Every syllable dripped with the coded language of generations past. Dressed in legal robes, delivered through judicial smiles, but forged from the same old prejudice. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind that doesn't need to, because it knows the room has always backed it. That's the part that burned the most. He didn't just insult her, he assumed the courtroom would agree, but Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't clench her fists. She didn't look down, because she knew this wasn't just a courtroom, it was a stage. And Judge Holloway, he wasn't in control of the scene. Not really. He was playing a part that was becoming dangerously outdated. He just didn't know it yet. This wasn't the 1980s, and she wasn't the stereotype he expected. She wasn't here to be humbled. She wasn't here to plead. She was here to confront. And every second she held his gaze without flinching, without reacting, she was breaking something older than both of them. The expectation that she would fold. He thought his words had power, but what he didn't understand was that his voice was no longer the only one that mattered. And soon it would be the quiet woman in the navy blue suit, not the laughing judge who would own the room. The moment the clerk announced the start of the proceedings, a hush fell over the courtroom. Not the respectful kind, but the kind that comes before something ugly. All eyes were on Judge Holloway as he adjusted his glasses with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He didn't look at the law books. He didn't look at the facts. He looked straight at Jasmine Crockett, and in that gaze was no curiosity, no search for truth, only judgment already passed. His expression was that of a man who had seen this movie before and thought he knew exactly how it ended. He leaned forward, resting both elbows on the bench, and let the weight of his words settle into the silence like a brick through glass. "Let me guess," he said, his voice oily, mocking, weaponized. "You're going to tell me you were wrongfully arrested?" He said it like it was a punchline, like her entire presence in the courtroom was some kind of personal comedy to him. The way his eyebrows lifted, the way his mouth curled upward just enough to be cruel. It was all theater, and Jasmine was supposed to be the fool. He didn't ask because he wanted to hear her side. He asked because he didn't care. The question wasn't an invitation. It was a warning, a signal that this court didn't operate on fairness. It ran on presumption, and she had already lost before she said a single word. The words wrongfully arrested weren't treated as a serious claim. They were reduced to a tired excuse, a cliché, something women like her were expected to say, something men like him were trained to dismiss. A few heads in the gallery turned slightly, not because they were shocked, but because they'd seen this too many times. The system didn't need facts to function. It thrived on patterns, and Jasmine had just been slotted into one. The prosecutor didn't object. He didn't even glance up. The bailiff didn't blink. Even the stenographer paused, as if unsure whether the judge's mockery was worth recording. And there in the middle of it all, Jasmine remained perfectly still. Not because she was frozen, but because she understood something the judge didn't. She had already won something far more powerful than his approval: control over her own narrative. What Holloway failed to see, what he had always failed to see in women who looked like Jasmine, was that his question wasn't disarming her. It was exposing him. His sarcasm didn't make him seem sharp. It made him small. Because in that moment, surrounded by state seals, wooden benches, and the illusion of justice, the only thing on trial wasn't Jasmine's character. It was his. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her reply cut through the courtroom like a blade made of calm steel. "I believe we should stick to facts, Your Honor," she said, her tone even, crisp and composed. There was no tremor in her voice, no hint of anger or defensiveness, only precision. The words hung in the air, bold in their restraint, a quiet rebuke dressed in diplomacy. It wasn't just a response, it was a line drawn in the sand. She had just refused to play the role he'd cast for her, the flustered, desperate defendant scrambling to prove her worth. Instead, she redirected the courtroom to the one thing the judge was clearly avoiding: the truth. Her statement landed hard, not because it was loud, but because it exposed the very foundation of his mockery as hollow speculation. The smirk on Judge Holloway's face faltered, just slightly, as if for a split second he realized he'd underestimated the woman sitting across from him. Jasmine didn't stop there. Her gaze remained steady as she added, "I'm not here to debate opinions. I'm here to present facts that were ignored, dismissed, or never even asked for." It was more than a statement. It was a confrontation made with elegance. It was a moment that shifted the room, even if subtly. Jurors looked up, curious now. The prosecutor's pen stopped moving. The bailiff straightened ever so slightly. No one had expected her to answer like that, with poise, with clarity, with control. But Jasmine had spent a lifetime learning how to be direct without being labeled difficult, assertive, without being branded aggressive. Her response wasn't just about self-defense. It was about exposing the imbalance of a system that allowed a judge to mock a citizen without evidence. She had called out the unspoken rules of the courtroom in real time, without ever breaking decorum. And in doing so, she didn't just defend herself, she challenged the room to reconsider who truly held the power. Holloway thought he was putting her in her place, but in that moment, Jasmine made it clear. She already knew exactly where she stood, and it wasn't beneath him. For the briefest of moments, Judge Holloway froze. It was subtle. No gasp, no dramatic pause. But it was there. A flicker in his eyes, a hesitation in his breath, like a man caught off guard by something he didn't expect but couldn't admit rattled him. Jasmine's calm wasn't just unnerving, it was disarming. He was used to defendants squirming, stuttering, apologizing before they even opened their mouths. He was used to power through intimidation, to silence mistaken for respect. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't play along. Her voice remained level, her hands steady, her gaze unbroken, and that, more than any objection, pierced his armor. Holloway's whole authority was built on reaction, but Jasmine gave him none. And in that absence, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: exposed. It wasn't just that she stayed calm, it was that she refused to shrink under his weight. Her composure challenged the hierarchy he relied on, the unspoken rule that said fear was respect and silence was submission. Jasmine had turned that rule on its head. Without raising her voice or moving a muscle, she had shifted the dynamic, and Holloway didn't like it. Because if she wasn't afraid, if she wasn't scrambling to prove herself, then who was really in control of the room? Her stillness held a mirror to his performance and reflected everything hollow about it. And for the first time, he realized this wasn't going to be the quick, one-sided proceeding he had planned. She had come prepared, not to plead, but to expose. And his carefully constructed sense of superiority was beginning to crack. Jasmine's hand moved with quiet precision, slipping into the inside pocket of her blazer like someone retrieving a pen. Measured, controlled, deliberate. But to the eyes watching her, it wasn't just a motion, it was a provocation. The bailiff, a thick-necked officer in a dark blue uniform with a rigid jawline and a chest full of unearned authority, immediately jolted upright. His right hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching just once, as though itching to draw before thinking. His stance widened. His breathing quickened. He didn't speak, but his body screamed readiness, as if the courtroom had suddenly shifted from a place of law to a battlefield. One movement. That's all it took. One movement from the wrong kind of woman in the wrong kind of room, and everything turned to glass. Breakable, brittle, seconds from shattering, and Jasmine felt it. She always did. It was the same cold tension she felt in elevators, in airports, in boardrooms. The invisible line between being professional and being perceived as dangerous. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't lunged. She hadn't raised her voice. All she had done was reach, and that alone triggered a tactical response. The injustice wasn't hidden. It wasn't coded. It was happening in real time, in front of a judge, a jury, and a silent room full of witnesses who had seen enough of the world to know what was unfolding and yet still said nothing. Because fear of her, not for her, was more acceptable than fairness toward her. The bailiff didn't move to protect her. He moved to contain her. And the sickest part was, he didn't even know why. Not really. He was just reacting the way the system had taught him to react his whole life. Assume the worst when she doesn't look afraid. Judge Holloway leaned forward, lips parting, already forming another sarcastic jab he thought would seal his dominance over the room. The look in his eyes said it all. He was ready to humiliate her, to remind everyone who held the gavel and who held nothing. His voice began to rise, that smug cadence sharpening like a knife being drawn across stone. But then he saw it. His words caught in his throat as Jasmine, calm and unhurried, withdrew a small black leather case from the inside of her blazer. His smirk faltered, jaw stiffening just slightly, as the object in her hands shifted the entire atmosphere. It wasn't large, it wasn't flashy, but it radiated authority in a way that no courtroom title ever could. The bailiff's posture snapped upright, the prosecutor stopped scribbling mid-note, and the air seemed to thicken with collective anticipation. Holloway's eyes narrowed, not in confidence now, but in calculation, suddenly unsure of what he was looking at. For the first time, the narrative was slipping out of his grip. His performance was interrupted, not by noise, not by outburst, but by a silent symbol of power he hadn't accounted for. He expected fear. He expected pleading. He expected another powerless woman fumbling for excuses. Instead, he was watching a masterclass in control. The courtroom, which had moments earlier been a theater for his ego, was now frozen in suspense. Because of her. The leather case in her hand wasn't a threat, but it was dangerous to him. Because whatever it held, it didn't belong in the hands of someone he had just laughed at. It belonged in the hands of someone he would be forced to reckon with. And as she began to open it, every word he had prepared, every insult, every dismissal, died on his tongue. Judge Holloway had walked into that morning, thinking he'd control the story. But now in front of a silent courtroom and a woman who refused to play along, he realized, he was about to become part of hers. Jasmine flicked open the black leather case with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly what kind of silence would follow. And then it appeared, neatly fitted, immaculately preserved, glowing under the courtroom's pale lights. A gold-embossed badge rested beside a laminated credential marked with bold, unmistakable words. Senior White House Advisor. Beneath it, the seal of the President of the United States gleamed like a brand of absolute authority, its eagle insignia catching the light as if the badge itself had spoken. For a moment, the room forgot how to breathe. Gasps were swallowed. Pens stopped scribbling. Even the ancient hum of the overhead lights seemed to hush in recognition. The courtroom, a place built to intimidate, had been brought to its knees by a nameplate and a seal. Not because they feared her, but because they had judged her before they ever asked who she was. The bailiff blinked twice, hands frozen mid-hover. The prosecutor's mouth parted slightly, his carefully composed mask shattering as his eyes locked on the badge like he was staring at a grenade. A juror dropped her notepad. Another leaned forward as if hoping proximity would make the truth clearer. And at the center of it all, Judge Holloway sat paralyzed, his face drained of color, his lips pressed together so tightly they seemed to vanish. Because in that moment, the power he thought he wielded was gone, ripped away, not by force, but by fact. The woman he mocked, the woman he dismissed, the woman he never thought to question, was sitting in front of him with the full weight of the federal government behind her. And it was too late to take back the laugh, too late to unmake the assumptions, too late to pretend that justice had ever stood on level ground. Jasmine opened the leather case with deliberate calm, her fingertips moving with the certainty of someone who had done this before. Not in courtrooms like this, but in rooms with far more power and far less patience for pretense. The lid unfolded with a soft snap, and what lay inside wasn't loud or oversized. It didn't need to be. A sleek government credential glinted beneath the overhead lights, bordered in navy and gold, stamped with the presidential seal so sharp, so official, it seemed to silence the air itself. Beside it sat a polished badge, minimal yet unmistakable. Senior White House Advisor, the title bold in embossed letters, flanked by the insignia of executive authority. The courtroom, so loud just seconds before with unspoken judgment, froze as if someone had cut the oxygen. No one moved. No one blinked. Even the rustling of jackets, the clicking of pens, the shuffling of jury chairs ceased in perfect unison. It wasn't respect. It was shock. And in that shock lived a truth that stung more than any gavel ever could. They had all judged her by what she looked like, not who she was. The bailiff lowered his hand slowly, as if awakening from a trance, his fingers inching away from his weapon like he realized how close he'd come to a mistake that couldn't be undone. The prosecutor stared at the badge as though it were radioactive. Not because he didn't believe it, but because deep down he did, and that terrified him. Jurors leaned forward in unison, their body language shifting from passive indifference to stunned attention, suddenly aware that this wasn't the trial they thought they were watching. And at the bench, Judge Holloway sat frozen, his eyes locked on the badge, his mouth slightly open, caught mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-collapse. He had spent years mastering the room with his voice, but now his silence was the only thing left. Because in that small leather case, Jasmine hadn't just revealed her credentials, she had revealed his failure. It wasn't just that she had authority, it was that she had it all along, and none of them had bothered to ask. Not the officers who detained her, not the clerks who processed her paperwork, not the judge who laughed before hearing a single fact. The injustice wasn't just in the arrest, it was in the assumption, the laziness, the arrogance of a system so sure of itself, it didn't think twice before turning her into a defendant. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't raise her voice or offer a lecture. She simply placed the badge in front of her like a royal flush at the end of a long, brutal hand. No fanfare, no explanation, just proof. Clean, undeniable, damning. And as that badge caught the light once more, the room saw clearly for the first time who had actually walked through that door. Not a suspect, not a statistic, not a woman asking for mercy, but a reckoning dressed in navy, backed by the highest office in the land, and absolutely unwilling to be ignored. Her voice cut through the stunned silence like a scalpel, precise, steady, and impossible to ignore. Jasmine didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. She simply looked up at the bench, locked eyes with Judge Holloway, and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had said this exact line in far more powerful rooms. I am the Senior Legal Advisor for National Security Policy at the White House Office of Policy Coordination, she said, enunciating each word with the clarity of someone who wasn't introducing herself, but correcting the room. Gasps rippled through the gallery, subtle but unmistakable. The courtroom had been quiet before, but now it was silent in shame. What made the moment so devastating wasn't just her title. It was the realization that they all should have known. The judge sat motionless, blinking slowly, his lips parted slightly like a man trying to swallow a mistake too large to hide. This wasn't a bluff. This wasn't a trick. This was real. Jasmine Crockett was not just a wrongfully accused woman. She was a national-level policy advisor with federal clearance, someone trusted with information most of the people in that room weren't even allowed to read. And yet she had been dragged in like a criminal, mocked before speaking, judged before being asked her name. The irony was brutal. A courtroom built to protect the rule of law had become the very place where it was violated, with prejudice, with arrogance, and with complete disregard for truth. And now the truth stood in front of them, composed and devastatingly precise, daring them to say another word. Without so much as a tremor in her hand, Jasmine reached into the side of her structured leather handbag and withdrew a large government-sealed envelope, thick, rigid, and marked not with fear, but with force. The paper itself looked expensive, smooth and uncreased, bearing the embossed seal of the Executive Office of the President of the United States, an unmistakable emblem that glinted faintly under the cold courtroom lights. As she laid the envelope on the defense table with quiet finality, the room leaned in, instinctively, as though the gravity of what she was about to reveal had sucked the air from every pair of lungs in the chamber. She didn't raise her voice, didn't dramatize her movements. That wasn't necessary. The moment was loud on its own. With the poise of a surgeon and the tone of a federal investigator, she spoke, clearly, calmly, and with devastating precision. This is a sealed complaint issued by the White House Office of Legal Counsel, reviewed and signed off by the President's senior legal advisors. She let the sentence linger for a moment, as if daring anyone in the room to interrupt. No one did. Her eyes scanned across the courtroom, not in arrogance but in full awareness that what she was holding was more than paper. It was evidence. It was accountability. It was the kind of truth this room wasn't used to seeing placed on the defense table. It outlines multiple violations of federal law committed during my unlawful detainment, she continued, her voice like iron wrapped in velvet, including false documentation, racial profiling, and procedural misconduct. A low rustle moved through the gallery, jurors shifting in their seats, the court clerk momentarily frozen with her fingers above the keyboard. The prosecutor's face went pale, the color draining slowly as his eyes locked on the document like it might detonate at any second. But the real impact struck where it was aimed, straight at Judge Holloway. His chin twitched. His breathing grew shallower. His fingertips, now gripping the edge of the bench, had gone bone white. His authority, so firmly asserted just minutes ago with laughter and disdain, now felt paper-thin against the weight of federal process. And Jasmine? She didn't blink, because this wasn't just about her. This was about the institution that had failed her, about the officers who didn't check her credentials, the paperwork that was doctored to justify a false arrest, and the courtroom that dared to laugh before it listened. That envelope wasn't a plea. It was a reckoning. Backed by the most powerful legal office in the country, it shattered the illusion that this trial had ever been legitimate. Jasmine hadn't come to be judged. She had come to deliver judgment, and she had brought the full weight of the law with her. The contents of the document were not vague summaries or polite legal suggestions. They were a methodical dissection of everything that had gone wrong, each paragraph a scalpel cutting through layers of corruption and complacency. It began with the time-stamped timeline of Jasmine's arrest, showing the exact moment federal protocols were ignored. The officers who detained her had not only failed to request identification, they had actively dismissed her attempts to show it. The report noted that within 17 minutes of the encounter, 2 separate procedural violations had occurred: the refusal to verify federal credentials and the denial of legal counsel during questioning. Then came the falsified reports, typed, signed, and uploaded to the court's secure database, each one carrying statements that directly contradicted not only Jasmine's account, but surveillance footage pulled from nearby municipal cameras. These weren't errors, they were fabrications, intentional, coordinated, and filed under oath. The document further outlined how the falsified arrest report had been fast-tracked, bypassing normal oversight channels, with 2 supervisors signing off without reviewing attached evidence. Emails were included, real, dated, and traceable, where officers used language that implied Jasmine had been aggressive and non-compliant, despite video showing her calmly identifying herself as a federal official. The most harrowing section of the report, however, came in the legal interpretation, a direct citation of federal statutes that had been violated by the officers, including obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, and malicious prosecution. These weren't theoretical charges. They were actionable crimes under federal law. Crimes that had been committed against Jasmine and now sat fully documented in a folder on the courtroom table, in full view of a judge who had laughed at her just minutes earlier. The report didn't just indict a few bad actors. It painted a picture of systemic decay, a culture where bias could slip through the cracks of procedure, where assumptions overruled protocol, and where a woman like Jasmine, black, composed, unyielding, could be seen as a threat rather than a leader. It exposed how fragile the illusion of fairness truly was, how easily a courtroom could be transformed from a hall of justice into a theater of humiliation. And worst of all, it forced everyone in the room to face a brutal question. If she hadn't carried that badge, if she hadn't had that document, would anyone have believed her? Jasmine didn't need to speak those words aloud. The report did it for her. Every signature, every timestamp, every policy violation was a mirror held up to a system that had failed. Not just her, but itself. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The restraint in her tone was more devastating than any outburst could have been. She stood still, composed, her shoulders squared, and her expression unreadable. Not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned long ago that dignity was the sharpest weapon in a room built to deny it. "No one asked me who I was," she said, each word deliberate, slicing through the room like a slow-moving blade. "They didn't check my ID. They didn't verify my clearance. They didn't even pause long enough to ask me a single question. All they saw was a black woman in a suit, standing next to a government vehicle, and that alone was enough to decide I was a threat." Her voice didn't crack. Her hands didn't shake. But behind that calm was a lifetime of being presumed guilty before given a chance to speak. The courtroom was silent, but not out of respect. It was stunned into stillness, suffocated by the weight of a truth no one in that room could deny. Jasmine didn't just call out her mistreatment, she exposed the mechanism behind it. A society, a system, a courtroom that claimed to uphold justice, yet still defaulted to fear at the sight of someone like her. "I was wearing a federal badge on my belt, standing next to a vehicle with diplomatic clearance. And none of that mattered," she continued, "because before I could say anything, before I had a chance to explain, they had already decided I didn't belong." Her words hung heavy in the air, not just because they were true, but because they were familiar. Familiar to too many. The kind of truth that made people shift in their seats not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. Judge Holloway, now visibly stiff in his chair, said nothing. His silence wasn't strength. It was survival. Because deep down, he knew the worst part wasn't that she was arrested. It was that everyone in the chain of command, from the officers on the street to the clerks in the courthouse, had played their part without question. And now, standing in front of them, Jasmine had pulled the curtain back on all of it. "If I had been anyone else," she said, voice low but steady, "if my skin had been lighter, if my title had been assumed instead of doubted, I wouldn't be standing here." That final sentence wasn't emotional. It wasn't exaggerated. It was simply the truth, undeniable, documented, and now spoken aloud in the very room that tried to silence her. Judge Holloway sat frozen behind the bench, his mouth slightly open, but no sound emerging, as if words had suddenly abandoned him. His hands gripped the edge of the desk with such force that his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The blood drained from his fingers like air sucked from a collapsing room. The robe that once gave him power now looked like a costume, ill-fitting, theatrical, inadequate for the reality unraveling before him. His eyes darted briefly across the courtroom, but there was nowhere safe to look. Not at the jurors, who now questioned his integrity. Not at the prosecutor, whose silence had become complicity. And certainly not at Jasmine, who stood in complete control of a moment he thought he owned. The silence around him was deafening. Not the silence of authority, but of collapse. This wasn't the quiet of respect. This was the silence of exposure. Holloway's breathing had changed, shorter now, shallower, as if every breath was heavier than the last. His body language betrayed him. The arrogance, the smirk, the gavel-happy bravado had evaporated, replaced by something raw and deeply unfamiliar. Fear. Not fear of Jasmine. Fear of the truth. Fear that the story he thought he was writing, another open and shut case, another powerless defendant, was being overwritten in real time, and he was no longer the narrator. He had underestimated her, dismissed her, mocked her, and now in front of a courtroom that no longer looked at him with certainty, he realized the most terrifying thing a man like him could ever face. He had misjudged someone smarter, stronger, and far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Judge Holloway finally found his voice, though it trembled beneath the weight of everything that had unraveled. He cleared his throat, grasping for control, and muttered, "This appears to be a misunderstanding, an unfortunate mix-up." The words rang hollow, brittle, like glass trying to hold back a flood. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply looked him dead in the eyes, unwavering, composed, and with the full weight of someone who had been waiting years to say what needed to be said. Her voice was low, deliberate, each word like a hammer striking the floor of that courtroom with precision. "This is not a misunderstanding," she said, her eyes locked on his with chilling clarity. "This is what happens when a system gives power to people who use it to humiliate instead of protect, who mock before they listen and condemn before they know." The room didn't move. The courtroom, once owned by the judge's voice, now belonged entirely to hers. She took one step forward, just enough to make the space between them feel personal, like truth pressing into the last layer of denial. "This isn't just about me," she continued. "It's about a system that allows people in authority to wield arrogance like it's a right, without consequence, without question." Her tone never rose, but it cut deeper than a scream. Holloway shrank behind the bench, visibly so, as though the robe could no longer shield him from the mirror being held to his face. Jasmine's final words fell like the last nail in a coffin, calm, deliberate, unforgiving. "Today you mocked the wrong person." And with that, every pretense of control in that courtroom shattered into silence. The prosecutor jolted to his feet as if the floor beneath him had caught fire, his chair screeching backward with a loud scrape that startled the silence. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, though his face was already drained of all color, sweat collecting at his brow. For a moment he looked like he might try to speak, but nothing came out, only the sound of shallow breath and panic trying to find a voice. Finally, with a shaky exhale, he forced the words into the air. "Your Honor," he began, his voice uneven, cracking on the second syllable. "In light of this new information, the prosecution moves to withdraw all charges against Ms. Crockett immediately." The phrase hung there like a white flag, not just of surrender, but of guilt, an unspoken admission that the system had failed, and now everyone in the room knew it. He didn't look at Jasmine when he said it. He couldn't. The shame was too fresh, too visible. He stared at the judge instead, eyes pleading, not for approval, but for permission to escape the wreckage. But it was too late. His silence earlier had already said enough, and now this gesture, though necessary, was nothing more than damage control. The courtroom remained frozen, processing the moment in stunned disbelief. And though Jasmine didn't move, didn't speak, the shift was unmistakable. She had turned the entire balance of power upside down. What had begun as a trial against her had become a trial of the courtroom itself, and the verdict had just been delivered, not by a jury, but by truth. Judge Holloway remained still, visibly battling with the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a collapsing ceiling. His lips parted, then closed again, as if trying to form a response that might salvage even a sliver of dignity from the wreckage around him. But there was nothing left to argue, no space for rebuttal, no high ground to retreat to. The evidence sat like a loaded weapon on the defense table. The badge glinted under courtroom lights like a silent verdict. And Jasmine Crockett, still composed, still silent, stood as an undeniable contradiction to everything he had assumed. The courtroom, once his domain, now felt foreign, hostile even, no longer bending to the force of his voice, but waiting, watching to see if he would admit what they all now knew. His pride was choking him, visible in the twitch of his jaw, the subtle tremor in his fingers gripping the bench. Finally, after what felt like an eternity measured in held breaths and sharpened stares, he exhaled, sharp, bitter, reluctant. "The court," he muttered, each word dragged from the depths of his crumbling authority, "formally dismisses all charges against Ms. Crockett." The phrase didn't land like a gavel strike. It landed like a confession. Quiet, defeated, almost apologetic. There was no trace of the man who, minutes earlier, had laughed aloud at a woman he knew nothing about. His voice was thin, almost hoarse, stripped of the arrogance that once filled this room like smoke. He looked down as he said it, not out of protocol, but out of shame. The same shame that now clung to every inch of his robe like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed out. No one applauded. No one moved. The silence wasn't awkward. It was surgical, clean, cold. The kind of silence that marks the end of something broken. And though no one said it out loud, everyone knew what they had just witnessed. This wasn't a courtroom victory. It was an exposure, a reckoning, a moment when the scales of justice finally tilted. Not because the system worked, but because one woman refused to be crushed by it. Judge Holloway had dismissed the charges, yes, but more than that, he had dismissed himself, his credibility, his authority, and any illusion that his courtroom had ever been about fairness. In that single sentence, delivered with trembling lips, he didn't just clear Jasmine's name. He confirmed everything she had just exposed. And as the silence settled once more, it was no longer Jasmine who stood accused. It was the system she had just dismantled, one truth at a time. This time, Judge Holloway didn't control the silence. He was buried beneath it. The authority he once projected with a glance, a word, or the wave of a hand had vanished like smoke under the weight of exposed truth. His bench, once a throne, from which verdicts were cast like lightning bolts, now looked more like a cage, high enough to isolate him, but no longer high enough to protect him. The robe on his shoulders, once a symbol of dignity and power, now clung to him like wet fabric, heavy, suffocating, and stripped of meaning. He sat there, hands clenched, posture shrunken, trying to hold on to the last remnants of a status that had slipped through his fingers the moment Jasmine spoke her truth. He was no longer the center of the room. He was no longer the voice people waited on. His power had not been taken. It had been revealed to be hollow. The courtroom, once an extension of his will, had shifted its gravity. The eyes of the jurors, once deferential to every tone he used, now flicked past him like he wasn't even there. The bailiff, who would have once jumped to follow his every nod, now stood still, arms crossed, watching the judge with a look that hovered somewhere between confusion and disapproval. Even the court reporter, trained to capture every utterance from the bench with robotic neutrality, now typed with the rhythm of someone recording the fall of something larger than a case. And in the middle of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, not elevated by any bench, not wrapped in robes, not wielding a gavel, yet owning every ounce of control with nothing more than her truth and her presence. This wasn't just the loss of power, it was the end of illusion. Judge Holloway had believed for decades that the courtroom bent to him, that justice was something he delivered, not something he had to answer to. But the room had learned otherwise. They had seen what power actually looked like, unapologetic, poised, and immune to intimidation. Jasmine didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't demand, and yet she had dismantled everything he stood on, piece by piece, with precision and calm. She had revealed what no robe could cover, that the system he upheld without question could collapse the moment someone refused to bow to it. Holloway didn't just lose a case that day. He lost the room. He lost the myth of his authority. And as he sat there in silence, it was no longer his courtroom. It was hers. This time, Judge Holloway didn't control the silence. He was buried beneath it. The authority he once projected with a glance, a word, or the wave of a hand had vanished like smoke under the weight of exposed truth. His bench, once a throne from which verdicts were cast like lightning bolts, now looked more like a cage, high enough to isolate him, but no longer high enough to protect him. The robe on his shoulders, once a symbol of dignity and power, now clung to him like wet fabric, heavy, suffocating, and stripped of meaning. He sat there, hands clenched, posture shrunken, trying to hold on to the last remnants of a status that had slipped through his fingers the moment Jasmine spoke her truth. He was no longer the center of the room. He was no longer the voice people waited on. His power had not been taken. It had been revealed to be hollow. The courtroom, once an extension of his will, had shifted its gravity. The eyes of the jurors, once deferential to every tone he used, now flicked past him like he wasn't even there. The bailiff, who would have once jumped to follow his every nod, now stood still, arms crossed, watching the judge with a look that hovered somewhere between confusion and disapproval. Even the court reporter, trained to capture every utterance from the bench with robotic neutrality, now typed with the rhythm of someone recording the fall of something larger than a case. And in the middle of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, not elevated by any bench, not wrapped in robes, not wielding a gavel, yet owning every ounce of control with nothing more than her truth and her presence. This wasn't just the loss of power, it was the end of illusion. Judge Holloway had believed for decades that the courtroom bent to him, that justice was something he delivered, not something he had to answer to. But the room had learned otherwise. They had seen what power actually looked like, unapologetic, poised, and immune to intimidation. Jasmine didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't demand, and yet she had dismantled everything he stood on, piece by piece, with precision and calm. She had revealed what no robe could cover, that the system he upheld without question could collapse the moment someone refused to bow to it. Holloway didn't just lose a case that day, he lost the room. He lost the myth of his authority. And as he sat there in silence, it was no longer his courtroom. It was hers. Jasmine crossed the threshold with measured grace, not once looking back, because she didn't need to. The damage was already done, not by force, not by theatrics, but by the undeniable weight of truth spoken in a room designed to suppress it. Every step she took toward the exit felt like the closing of a chapter, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever walked into that courtroom expecting fairness and found only assumption. The silence that followed her departure was deafening, but not empty. It was charged, almost sacred. It was the kind of silence that comes after something has shifted permanently, when people realize they've witnessed not just a legal proceeding, but a reckoning. There was no applause, no grand gesture, only the creaking of the courtroom doors as they slowly shut behind her, like the final punctuation to a sentence written in resilience. Judge Holloway remained at his bench, not in power, but in paralysis. His posture, once proud and commanding, had caved in on itself, shoulders slumped, hands limp at his sides. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came. He knew, with horrifying clarity, that no explanation would undo what had just unfolded in front of a room full of witnesses. Witnesses who had seen not only his failure, but his exposure. His authority didn't just erode, it collapsed. He had believed for decades that the robe on his back was armor, that the elevation of the bench gave him control, and that the silence of the courtroom meant respect. But Jasmine shattered all three illusions without ever raising her voice. Her calm composure had done what years of oversight, complaints, or whispered doubts never could. It stripped away the myth of his infallibility. He sat there, still cloaked in black, but it now looked more like mourning than judgment. Because what had died that day wasn't just a case. It was the idea that bias could live unchecked beneath the surface forever. The truth Jasmine presented didn't just clear her name. It indicted a way of thinking, a culture of courtroom superiority that had gone unquestioned for too long. Her presence had held up a mirror, and what it reflected was too ugly to look away from. Holloway wasn't grieving the end of a trial. He was grieving the end of the illusion that he was still fit to judge anyone. The prosecutor remained standing, eyes cast downward, unwilling to sit beside a man who had just been publicly unmasked. The bailiff stayed still, unsure if protocol even applied anymore. And the jurors? They didn't look at the bench. They looked at the empty space where Jasmine had stood, the only place in the room that had ever truly held power. Outside the courtroom, the world would soon learn what happened here. The sealed documents would reach federal desks. The footage, the transcripts, the silence, it would all become part of something larger. But inside, in that moment, the shift was already complete. Judge Holloway wasn't feared. He wasn't obeyed, he was finished. And he knew deep in the pit of his stomach that history would not remember him for the thousands of verdicts he had rendered, but for the one time he laughed at the wrong woman. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a case. She exposed a legacy. And the man who once believed himself the final word in every room now sat beneath the weight of her silence. A silence that would echo long after she was gone. It didn't take long. Within hours of the courtroom doors closing behind Jasmine Crockett, the story ignited like a brush fire in a dry canyon. The footage, raw, damning, and painfully clear, found its way onto every major news outlet before dusk. A camera, discreetly positioned near the back of the courtroom for routine documentation, had inadvertently captured what would become one of the most talked about courtroom moments in modern judicial history. Viewers across the country sat frozen as the video showed Judge Holloway mocking a woman he presumed to be just another defendant, only to be stopped cold when Jasmine calmly revealed her badge and identity as a senior White House legal advisor. By the time the evening news aired, the footage had already spread to millions. News anchors spoke with barely disguised urgency. A shocking moment in a local courtroom, one declared, her voice a mix of disbelief and outrage, where a federal advisor was arrested, humiliated, and nearly prosecuted, all while carrying the full weight of the executive branch. Headlines flashed in bold letters. White House advisor wrongfully detained. Judge brought to silence by secret truth. Justice system on trial. Social media moved even faster. The hashtag #, Justice for Jasmine surged into the top trending spot within 90 minutes of the story breaking. Just behind it came System on Trial and Black and Qualified. Thousands began sharing clips of Jasmine's poised response, looping the moment she opened her badge case and set it gently on the defense table, overlaid with quotes like, "Calm is not weakness, and truth doesn't need to shout." Influencers, lawyers, professors, students, civil rights activists, they all amplified the footage, calling it a watershed moment. Legal experts went live on podcasts and Twitter spaces, breaking down how not only the arrest but also the court's conduct reflected deep-rooted systemic rot. "This wasn't a fluke," said one former federal prosecutor. "It's a pattern. The difference is this time, the system tried to crush the wrong woman." Major newspapers quickly assigned investigative teams. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and ProPublica started digging into Judge Holloway's record, uncovering a history of disproportionately harsh rulings toward defendants of color. In one particularly damning op-ed, a legal scholar wrote, "What happened to Jasmine Crockett is not shocking. What's shocking is that we ever believed this wasn't happening every day in some form or another." Cable news turned it into a special feature. CNN hosted a primetime panel called Bias on the Bench, while MSNBC ran a documentary-style segment on wrongful arrests of Black federal employees. Even traditionally conservative networks couldn't look away. Footage doesn't lie, and the tape was brutal. In it, viewers saw every ounce of smugness on Judge Holloway's face before Jasmine revealed who she truly was. They saw his blood drain, the room freeze, the prosecutor stumble backward as though physically hit. And they saw Jasmine, unmoved, unwavering, dismantling the courtroom's power structure with nothing but truth and stillness. Outside of media, public reaction reached a boiling point. Demonstrations began forming in cities overnight. In Washington, D.C., a candlelight vigil was held in Lafayette Square, not far from where Jasmine worked, as attendees held signs that read, "She spoke, we heard." In Chicago, law students staged a walkout, demanding judicial bias training and independent oversight of federal courts. In Los Angeles, a mural of Jasmine was painted on the side of a courthouse wall within 24 hours, showing her mid-stance with her badge in one hand and the words "Never Assume" painted above her head in white. It wasn't just activists. Prominent figures began to speak out. Former presidents, civil rights icons, and even sitting senators commented publicly. One senator tweeted, When our courts mock truth and respect power only in robes, we all lose. Jasmine Crockett reminded us what real power looks like. Quiet, unyielding, and backed by truth. The tweet gained over 1 million likes in under 10 hours. Jasmine herself did not comment. She did not appear on camera, did not release a statement, did not speak to reporters camped outside her apartment. That silence only amplified her presence. Her absence became part of the story, a calm refusal to be pulled into spectacle. A single image captured by a journalist as she walked away from the courthouse doors became iconic. Jasmine in a navy blue suit, back straight, shoulders firm, sunlight catching the crest of her badge just before she tucked it away. It was shared over 5 million times in 2 days. Time magazine placed it on its cover under the headline, "The Woman Who Didn't Flinch." Meanwhile, the judicial world scrambled. The State Commission on Judicial Conduct announced an emergency review of Judge Holloway's recent cases. The Court Administration Office confirmed that dozens of prior defendants had already begun filing appeals. A coalition of civil rights attorneys proposed what they called the Crockett Protocol, a national policy for verifying credentials and preventing courtroom profiling. Federal judges quietly but urgently began reviewing their courtroom footage and internal practices. Within 48 hours, the American Bar Association issued a public statement calling the incident a sobering moment that demands reflection and reform at every level of our justice system. Law schools across the country included the footage in their ethics curriculum, some professors playing it on loop as the first lecture of the semester. But perhaps the most powerful response came not from institutions, but from individuals. Letters poured into Jasmine's office from across the country. Some were from young law students. Others were from older civil rights attorneys who had fought in courtrooms that never believed them. One came from a 12-year-old black girl in Georgia who wrote, "I didn't know someone like me could stand up in a room like that and win. Now I want to be just like you." And through it all, Jasmine said nothing. She kept working. She returned to her office in D.C., attended her policy meetings, reviewed national security briefings, and quietly continued shaping federal law. She didn't need to tell the world what had happened. The world had already seen it. The world had already listened. And more importantly, the world had started to change. The lesson didn't come with fireworks. It didn't come with shouting or revenge. It came in silence, unshakable, intentional silence, from a woman who had every reason to rage. Jasmine Crockett didn't win by overpowering the court. She won by revealing how fragile the illusion of justice becomes when held up against unshakable truth. Her victory wasn't just legal, it was human. In the face of arrogance, she offered composure. In the face of assumption, she offered credentials. And in the face of systemic blindness, she offered clarity so sharp it cut through generations of prejudice without drawing a single drop of blood. She reminded the world that justice doesn't scream, it stands. And when it stands tall enough, long enough, those who hide behind robes, titles, and fear have no choice but to fall silent before it. The real power of Jasmine's story lies not in what she proved about herself, but in what she exposed about the system that tried to break her. This wasn't the tale of one rogue judge or a single biased courtroom. It was a reflection of how deeply prejudice can be embedded into the structure of authority. So subtle, so routine, that no one questions it until someone like Jasmine forces them to. Her experience wasn't rare. What was rare was that she had the power, the presence, and the platform to shine a light on it while standing directly in the crosshairs. And she didn't just shine that light for herself. She aimed it outward, toward the forgotten, the overlooked, the routinely dismissed, toward every voice that had once been laughed at, dismissed, or silenced before it ever had a chance to speak. Her silence was not weakness, it was strategy, because silence can be many things: complicity, fear, surrender. But in Jasmine's hands, it became a weapon of precision, a refusal to entertain ignorance, a rejection of theatrics. Her calm forced the room to listen. Her restraint forced them to reflect. In a world that often expects women, especially black women, to be loud to be heard, Jasmine turned that expectation on its head. She taught a masterclass in presence, in dignity, in the quiet art of confrontation through facts rather than fury. And in doing so, she changed the shape of the room she was never supposed to control. There is a universal truth in her story that stretches beyond courtroom walls. That truth says, assumptions are dangerous. That truth says, dignity can be revolutionary. That truth says, the moment you judge someone based on who you think they are, rather than who they prove themselves to be, you have already lost your authority. Jasmine didn't need to shout to make the system hear her. She needed only to exist unapologetically, armed with her credentials, her integrity, and the courage to hold her ground when it would have been easier and safer to step back. That is where her power came from. Not from status, but from stillness, from conviction, from the knowledge that truth doesn't ask permission to be respected. And the deeper lesson, the one that lingers after the headlines fade, is that the system must never again require someone like Jasmine to prove her worth just to be treated with basic respect. That burden should never fall on the shoulders of the marginalized. Respect should not have to be earned through humiliation endured, credentials revealed, or silence weaponized. It should be the default, not the exception. But until that day comes, stories like Jasmine's will continue to matter. They will continue to teach. They will continue to haunt the halls of justice until every door, every bench, every badge, and every gavel remembers what they were built to serve. Her story is not one of vengeance. It is one of restoration. She didn't seek to destroy the court. She reminded it of what it was supposed to be. She didn't want the judge to fall. She wanted him to see, and in forcing him to look at himself, really look, she gave the entire nation a mirror it couldn't ignore. A mirror that asked not just, what happened here, but how often has this happened when no one was watching? That is the question that echoed louder than any gavel, longer than any statement. And it is the question that will keep echoing until justice no longer depends on who is sitting at the table or who dares to speak across it. So let Jasmine's story stand. Let it stand in classrooms and courtrooms. Let it stand in whispered conversations between law clerks and shouted chants in the streets. Let it stand as a lesson in what happens when quiet strength meets unchecked power. Let it stand because there are still so many who are expected to shrink in the face of robes and judgment. And let it remind us that sometimes the most radical thing you can do in a room built to silence you is to simply refuse to sit down.